Hey, podcast listeners. I've got a book. It's called Getting Gamers, The Psychology of Video Games and Their Impact on the People Who Play Them. You can go to psychologyofgames.com/book for more. That's it. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Psychology of Games podcast, where you learn about how psychology and video games interact to shape our behaviors, our beliefs, and our purchasing decisions. My name is Jamie Madigan, a psychology PhD and a lifelong gamer. I write, podcast, and lecture about this stuff on psychologyofgames.com, and I'll be your host. Ever get stressed? Ever just have a bad day at work or school or the school where you work? I'm not talking about a big spike in stress that you get when you get pulled over for speeding or right before you have to do an important presentation. There is that. But I'm talking about when pressure gets smeared out over a long period of time. Sometimes it's not even just one thing, but a cumulative weight of lots of little things that just wears you down by the end of the day or the end of the week. Whoa, wait. I can't afford to license that song. Let's see what else we got. Alright. This kind of thing is, unfortunately, a fact of life, so it's not surprising that psychologists have studied it. When you come home from that kind of day, you probably feel worn out, and you need to do something to recover your mental and emotional juice. People obviously recover from stress in different ways. Some exercise, some garden, some build things or create art, some socialize, some people just scream into pillows. But a lot of us use media, including video games, to recover from stress. One popular theory is that it takes mental resources to do all the things we need to do to get through our day. We need to allocate attention, control our emotions, think hard, exert physical effort, and resist telling Doug that, "Oh my God, your new baby looks like every other new baby we've ever seen. Do you actually need something, Doug, or can I get back to work?" Doing these things takes resources, and eventually those resources become sapped to the point where the person needs to recover them. Recovery happens when those resources are not being tapped, which frequently happens during nights and weekends. But it doesn't just happen magically. We have to engage in what's known as recovery experiences. There are supposedly 3 different kinds of experiences that lead to recovery: psychological detachment, relaxation, and mastery experiences. The first of these, psychological detachment, can be as simple as not being at work. It relies on the employee, or the student as the case may be, to do and think about something else for a change. Relaxation activities are those that most of us probably think of in response to the phrase, "taking it easy." These kinds of pastimes can be anything that the person enjoys and which is physically relaxing. Finally, mastery experiences are those that build new skills and a sense of accomplishment, and maybe even add new skills to our repertoire. One study distributed surveys that asked participants about what they did on the weekends. They also gathered lots of information about job performance and how grueling they found the work. The researchers found that, yes, the types of recovery experiences described above led to feeling recovered on Monday, and that the state of being recovered, in turn, led not only to doing better jobs, but also feeling that doing well at work actually required less effort. The study makes me think, dude, video games. Playing video games could lead to any and all of these recovery experiences. We play games to temporarily escape from reality, including our jobs or school. While some games leave us white-knuckled, others can be very relaxing. And at their heart, games are about mastery, developing new skills, and acquiring new knowledge. Aren't video games like the ideal recovery experience then? Well,
yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of converging research at the moment that suggests that video games can satisfy those criteria. And I think also potentially one advantage that it does have over things like team sports is that it's going to be a lot easier to fit in.
With all the typical media attention out there on negative consequences of playing games, violence, warped racial and gender views, addiction, time wasting, it's nice to see research suggesting the ways that video games could be good for your mental health. That's the topic of this week's interview with Dr. Emily Collins. Hey everybody, just a quick break to remind you about my Patreon campaign. If you like this website and if you like the podcasts, then you can help me out to keep things going by throwing a buck or two my way at patreon.com/POG. The support from the Patreon helps pay for hosting and other expenses related to the podcast and the website. And let's be honest, it keeps me on schedule and keeps me motivated to keep cranking these things out. So thank you to all of you who are Patreon supporters. I appreciate it. And if you're interested, like I said, you can go to patreon.com/POG. Thanks. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on the interview section of the podcast. My guest this episode is Dr. Emily Collins, who is going to talk to us about the use of video games to recover from our stressful lives, whether it be in work or in school or some combination of the two or whatever it is that's stressing you out. The idea of how people use media and video games in particular to deal with that sort of stuff. So, Dr. Collins or Emily, thanks for joining us.
No problem.
So why don't you kind of start off just telling us who are you and what are you doing here?
Great. So I'm a visiting researcher at the UCL Interaction Centre in London. So my research is mostly to do with video games and to do with the positive applications of games. So since starting at UCL, my work's been looking at kind of work-life balance and kind of how games can help with that, and but also how technology in other forms as well can impact on how people are relaxing after work, or kind of, if they're checking their emails, something like that.
Yeah, so work-life balance is one of those topics that seems like it's entered the mainstream a lot. You see a lot of mainstream coverage about it, and it's one of those phrases that comes up, in interviews and people considering jobs talking about, well, how am I going to be able to balance my personal interests and my home life with work? Can you just kind of tell us about the concept of recovering from stress, especially in the context of media use? So what are some of the consequences of having too bad a work-life balance and having not taking the time or having the ability to recover from work or school-related stress?
So post-work recovery is basically, it's like the official definition is the replenishing of depleted resources. But what that really means is just having a chance to kind of dissipate all the work stress that you've experienced during the day and just kind of reset, get everything back to normal. And one of the issues with not having a chance to recover, so if, for example, you're coming home and you're working all evening, and so you just don't have any chance to kind of reset any of your sort of psychological or physical resources, what you end up with is a building up of work stress. And so kind of in the short term, that can mean that you're not performing as well as at work. So if you're going to work the next day, you might find it more difficult to concentrate, you might make a few more mistakes. But then if that carries on happening, if you carry on not having a chance to recover, then it can lead to a few more serious things. So absenteeism from work, you might end up having more kind of physical or mental health issues. A couple of maybe slightly dramatic studies have linked a lack of recovery in the long term to burnout. So, getting just absolutely physically exhausted, and also disengaging from work, and then also cardiovascular problems. So, in theory, if you continue to not have any chance to recover, you could end up putting yourself at risk health-wise.
Right. Yeah, and burnout and inability to recover is kind of, as a side note, it's a widely discussed problem in the video game industry. If you're talking specifically about the people that make the video games, of that type of lifestyle, and some companies are doing better jobs than others in dealing with it. So it seems like, hey, people that make games should take some time out maybe to play them or do something else. So you talked about coming back and sort of unplugging and setting aside work. Like, what are the characteristics of an effective recovery experience or activity? Like, what are the things that you should look for, or the things that it allows you to do in order to recover from stress?
So existing research suggests that recovery kind of has 4 components. So you need to have a chance to relax. You need to have psychological detachment, which just refers to kind of having a chance to not think about work, to not have kind of, the stresses kind of going on in your mind once you've left. Also mastery. So you need to feel like you're good at something outside of work, or at the least that you're kind of got some kind of challenge that isn't work related. And also a sense of control as well. So ideally you need to feel like you're in charge of kind of how you spend your time, or aspects within those activities. So it's unlikely that you have any activity, like one activity that will satisfy all of those criteria, but the idea is that you're meant to have, together all the activities that you perform are kind of meant to tick those off, but that's going to be the most effective way to recover.
Okay. So all of those things sort of in combination or at the same time are more effective than just doing one or two?
Yeah, so I think most of the literature is focused on psychological detachment. So that one seems to be the most important, but you can't just kind of focus on that and then ignore everything else because, you need to also feel like you're relaxing. You need to also, feel like you're good at something else as well. But yeah, there's a few activities that the literature kind of argues are useful for those sorts of things. So things like physical activity is meant to be quite good. Social activities are also meant to be helpful. So, things like team sports that combine those two things are, meant to be one of the best things you can do really outside of work for recovery.
But for those of us who haven't, joined a basketball team or a volleyball league, going home and playing games sounds like it would hit on all four of those things. I mean, games literally require you to detach from the things going on around you, and there's been a lot of research on like immersion in games, and that is literally part of the definition of immersion is that you ignore the things outside of the game world and detach from that. Games can be relaxing, and good game design allows you to, a sense of autonomy and control, and it allows you to feel like you're progressing and getting better at something. So sounds to me like playing games might actually be better than physical exercise, but maybe I'm a little biased.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of converging research at the moment that suggests that video games can satisfy those criteria. And I think also potentially one advantage that it does have over things like team sports is that it's going to be a lot easier to fit in. I think one of the problems with the current work environment is a lot of people are working longer hours than they have done before. And so the idea of kind of coming home and then just popping out to play basketball or something like that doesn't really appeal. And it's a level of time commitment
Mm-hmm.
That I think a lot of people don't have. So yeah, potentially there is evidence to support the idea that games might be effective and also a lot easier to kind of fit in.
Yeah.
Actually do.
If you have half an hour or 45 minutes, you can play some games. So that it sounds like they do have the potential to do a lot of good there and help people recover from stress, which I guess is not exactly a revelatory statement. There's been a lot of research looking at, why people play games and this idea of, it helps me relax. I just like to come home and play some games after a stressful day, and it helps me relax. It helps me get my mind off things. Can you describe some of the actual research that's been done, and published that support this idea and actually measures how much games can actually help?
Okay, so most of the studies that have been conducted in this sort of area so far have been survey-based. So what they found is correlations between people, the amount of time people spend playing games, and also kind of how well recovered they are. So this is all kind of self-report kind of questionnaires that have been used. Interestingly, so there's some work that suggested that generally the more games you play, kind of better recovered you are. But there was also some indication that this might differ between different genres of games. So in one paper, it was saying that the authors were suggesting that perhaps, as you said earlier, like immersion might be important, especially in psychological detachment, because if games are sort of meant to be making you switch off, then the more involved you are in your activity, the more likely you are to be switched off and not thinking about something else. And so the study that we conducted was an online questionnaire that was looking at video game genres, and we did find a difference between like people who play different games and kind of what aspects of recovery that it was related to.
Okay. Can you drill down on that some more? Like what genres work better or differently?
Okay, so from our study, it seemed like first-person shooters were the only genre that correlated to the total recovery experience score. But then a couple of other ones also seem to be, equally as correlated. So yeah, mostly first person and action games seem to be most effective. But then you also had other games as well that taps into other things. So first person. Oh gosh, why can't I say that? First person shooter and action
Slow
games.
down.
Oh yeah. As soon as I stopped thinking about speaking slowly, that's okay. So yeah, those were correlated with relaxation mostly. But then you also had role-playing games that were correlated with relaxation as well, and massively multiplayer online role-playing games that were more mastery. So you kind of see how like different games will require different sorts of skills and will have different kinds of effects in terms of post-work recovery. So that was one of the things I thought was most interesting about that study.
Yeah, you could come up with all kinds of interesting hypotheses there that, first-person shooters might give you quicker and more accurate and more meaningful like feedback about how well you're doing, where role-playing games might allow you to make more meaningful decisions about how you progress through the game and what options you choose and how you develop your characters. And has there been any thoughts or research about like just individual differences and like what kind of gaming experience I prefer or what I'm looking for, and whether or not that mediates the relationship between enjoyment and using the games for recovery?
So there's a lot of literature that suggests that enjoyment is a massive part of this. So even though I'm saying that first-person shooter games are, one of the most effective in recovery, ultimately, if you don't like first-person shooter games, playing it, is not going to help you at all. So enjoyment is a massive part of it. I mean, ultimately, any post-work recovery activity has got to be enjoyable for it to be effective.
So, yeah, it seems like future research might look at then like, well, what kinds of games do you enjoy, or, what sort of, almost like bringing in the needs and gratification theory stuff about, well, what experience are you looking for in a game? Why are you looking to play it? And how does that impact your use of them for recovery? But research for another day, I guess. If there's any graduate students listening out there, there you go. There's your PhD dissertation. We're here to help. So one of the things, though, that it seems like games could differ on is how much social interaction they involve. So you play something like a massively multiplayer role-playing game, you're going to have, in a lot of instances, interactions with other people. You're going to be talking either via voice or text. You're going to be interacting with people. You're going to be thinking about what they're thinking of what you're doing, and vice versa. Does social support figure in anywhere? Does that affect how we use games for recovery?
So it definitely seems to. So in the study that we conducted, we found that online social capital. So social capital is just basically social support, really, and how kind of well supported you are by your community. So we found that online social support did mediate the relationship between digital game use and recovery experience. So that to us kind of indicates that if you are interacting with people online, and that makes it even more effective. And that corresponds really well with the existing research on post-work recovery.
Right.
Because, as I mentioned, social activities are a really big part of what they think is going to be effective. So it's interesting that potentially the interactions within games seem to as I say, this is an online survey that we did, so we can't quite kind of argue causality at this point.
Sure,
but
yeah.
Judging by everything else, it does seem like involving this kind of social component might make it more effective.
Yeah, and that lines up with a lot of the other research that I've read about the nature and quality of one's social network and like how that impacts their happiness and their ability to deal with adversity and, bad things happening in their lives, and shows that one of the best way to get over tragedy is to have an effective social network of people that will not only like help you in a literal sense, but just also sort of be there for you and be able to interact with and talk to people.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised at all to hear that. And it's kind of an interesting body of research. Just as a side note, the whole like, do online relationships how well can they substitute for face-to-face or real life? I hate that phrase, real life, because I think games are part of real life, but meet space, sort of offline relationships. Like, how well can those online relationships substitute? Like, where are they better? Where are they worse? Seems like a really interesting line of research. Just off the cuff, you have any interest or experience or knowledge about that sort of stuff? Like whether or not those two can substitute?
Well, I think it's kind of tricky because as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's much research that's tried to kind of compare online and offline relationships in quite that way. But what I do know about, so is when one of my PhD topics was looking at the kind of social factors surrounding playing online games, and a couple of things that came out of that were just that people sometimes valued their game relationships more than their offline relationships, just because there was all that automatic shared interest. You both were into this one game, or this like one kind of game.
Mm-hmm.
Also, people felt like the anonymity, or at least the kind of computer-based format of the communication meant that they could talk a bit more about sensitive topics. They could admit things that maybe they feel a bit too shy to in outside situations. So I think there's the potential for them to be equivalent. There's the potential for them to be even more valuable for some people. But yeah, I think it's always quite tricky. And I think especially in this sort of day and age, I think when I was first studying that was 2009, 2010, and it was
a different world. Yeah.
yeah, God, Slate. I wrote my PhD on a Slate. Yeah, God. But no, I think it has, even in just that time, things have changed in terms of categorization of relationships.
Yeah.
I don't think people quite have that distinction between these online friends and these offline friends. I think it's a lot more movement between them. So, I mean, that's one of the problems, I guess. We're trying to look at online relationships because, I mean, what counts as an online relationship? Is it someone that you talk to online, or is it someone that you met online? And,
mm-hmm.
Can be.
Yeah.
I think I'm going off into a completely different topic now. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and what does it mean to talk? Does that mean that you're interacting with them in a message board or voice chat or video chat? Yeah. But yeah, maybe you're right. That's a whole separate topic. I should look into that. So one of the other things that I found really interesting when I read the papers, the research that you did and the others on this topic is coping style. So people have different preferred methods of dealing with stress, right? So, I may deal with it in a different way than you do, and I may look for different experiences to help me, detach and relax and have a sense of control, etc. Can you talk about coping style and how that figures into this research?
So I suppose a lot of this kind of goes back to, there being a lot of individual differences in what is going to be effective for you, because it still needs to be something that you enjoy and something that that's going to be a pleasurable experience for you. And so that might not be the same for different people. But I know in one of the previous studies by Reinecker, he was arguing that people who were more likely to try to deal with their problems emotionally rather than sort of like in a problem solving sense were more likely to try to use media as a way of kind of dealing with their stress. So that's one thing, is that I think if you're maybe more, like, not more emotional, but if that is the way that you prefer to deal with things, and you're going to be wanting to adjust your emotional state, so it goes back to normal. And one way to do that is to, play games or watch a movie that you like or something like that. And that kind of ties into all the mood management theory of kind of, why we use media is to try to, maximize positive states. So that's kind of one side of it, I suppose.
So emotional coping would be more like, okay, I'm going to manage my emotions. I'm going to manage my mental state. I'm going to not let this get to me. Whereas problem solving would be more along the lines of, I'm going to fix the thing that's stressing me out.
Yeah. So, and it's not necessarily that one is better or worse than the other, because it's always kind of it will just depend on the situation and what it is that's bothering you. But yeah, the people who tend to deal with their problems in a kind of, a more kind of emotional regulation way, or maybe more likely to want to use games as a way of recovering.
So is there any indication of games for recovery working better for one preference or another in terms of coping style?
As far as I'm aware, that's not really been investigated.
Okay.
So I think it's just more like, kind of in terms of sort of preference, but it would be a very interesting thing to study. And I know that when they looked at kind of aspects of recovery in different areas, so this is a slightly niche study, but there's a study that looked at people who worked as air hostesses, and they were looking at when, what they did to recover, because obviously they're going to be in hotels and different places all the time. And they found that if they interacted socially with people after work, that actually increased levels of depression. And what it was is because they would have had a really stressful day, but they'd be in a hotel in the middle of nowhere with people that they knew. And so they sort of, apparently, the author was arguing that perhaps it was they felt like they should go out even though they really didn't want to.
Yeah.
So they were forcing themselves to be social, and in that way, that was actually having a detrimental effect on their recovery. So I think personal preferences, because if you are one of those people that you've had a stressful day and you don't want to talk to people,
it might go back to the old introvert extrovert, personality difference, and extroverts thrive and get energy on social interaction, and introverts, can deal with social interaction fine, but they need sort of their space to recover after doing so.
And so I wonder whether that's one of the reasons why potentially social interactions in games might be might be so effective, just because you don't have that kind of exhaustion. You can log in, you can log out, and you don't have that sort of pressure of having to be out until a decent time or having to see people face to face. So I think that's something that I'd really like to study. So it's totally just me kind of planning my research in my head. But yeah, I think that's something that would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah. Well, let me know once you figure it out. I'd like to hear it.
Once I've got this all sussed, I'll drop you a line.
Accept your first ever Nobel Prize in psychology that they decide to start giving out.
Oh yeah.
So this makes me want to circle back to something you said earlier and about the whole literature around, recovery and use of media for recovery is to allow people to, I think you said something along the lines of recharge or, replenish some internal resources. And it makes me think of all the research that was done on ego depletion, and the idea that we have this sort of internal well of mental juice or mental energy, and doing things that require, focusing our attention or problem solving or doing things that we don't want to, or dealing with stress or regulating our emotional state. Like those all deplete that pool of mental resources. And when we are ego depleted, there's a lot of literature out there to say that like, oh, we're susceptible to stress. We're susceptible to impulse purchases. We're susceptible to just sort of going with the status quo and making a decision. And we're more susceptible to being influenced. Does the research on ego depletion intersect at all with the research on recovery?
Yeah, there's a really interesting study that was published recently actually by Reinecker and colleagues. And yeah, they looked at people who are ego depleted because they found that people who are ego depleted were more likely to just put on a film or play games. But the problem was that they were more likely to use it as kind of a form of procrastination. So it wasn't seen as like an activity to them. It wasn't like, oh, I'm really looking forward to seeing this film. It was kind of just put on and then they just felt guilty about it. And because they felt guilty about it, they ended up feeling, negative, and it actually had a detrimental effect on recovery, which is kind of the reverse of a lot of what the other literature around it is saying. Because even though we're talking about digital games at the moment, even just watching a film is meant to help your recovery to some degree.
Right.
And so, yeah, the fact that if you feel, I think what it comes down to is this kind of your own experience of watching it. So in the end, if you feel negative about it, then potentially it's not going to be as beneficial as if you just kind of, accept that, you can watch a film and it doesn't, that's not just procrastination. That's not a bad way of spending your time necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've been there. I've come home and, in the evenings when I, normally might play games or work on something for the Psychology Games website, I'll instead look up and find out that I've been watching some TV show on Netflix for like the last 3.5 hours and it's like 11 o'clock and I feel really guilty and I feel awful. Like I've just wasted the evening. It's curious that I don't feel like, well, I now replenished. I'm now ready to like get up and go at things tomorrow.
And I think it is just that kind of guilt that means that you just kind of you're not seeing it as something that was fun. You're just seeing it as this massive waste of time that shouldn't have happened. And
one of the things that I hear a lot, people talk about when you say like, well, why do you play games, or maybe even specifically like why do you play violent games or these types of competitive shooters, and people will sometimes say like, well, they just let me get it all out of my system. They let me just have some sort of like feeling of getting it out there and sort of flushing it out of my system, which, sounds like what psychologists call the catharsis hypothesis, which is literally like experiencing an emotion or seeing somebody else experience it or experience it vicariously. And then that allows you to not feel that emotion anymore or allows you to sort of get it out of your system. Is there any evidence for this, concept of catharsis, either in general in the literature or specifically in the context of recovery?
So as far as I'm aware, it's not been investigated in terms of recovery, even though I think that would be really interesting. I think in terms of the violent video games and aggression research, I think the research is pretty mixed on catharsis. Obviously that kind of whole area is an absolute minefield of bad methodology and ridiculousness. which I feel like is an entirely different topic that I won't launch into my tirade about that.
And I just recently had a guest on that I talked to about that whole concept. So yeah, about the whole state of the literature on violence in video games. And yeah, it's a big discussion.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And so I think that it's very difficult to know exactly what research in that area to trust. And I'm digging myself a hole. But yeah, so I think that the research is quite mixed. I think there's some evidence for catharsis, but then there's also other studies that, despite seemingly being conducted very well, haven't found that. So I think it's kind of a tricky one. I mean, I know that one of the, as you're saying, kind of, potentially these, a lot of the kind of violent games, so first-person shooters or action games, we're saying, oh, they're quite relaxing, but in terms of sort of physiological responses, they're not. And so, you've got people who are going, oh, that was really relaxing, despite the fact that, they had elevated heart rate, they had like adrenaline responses. And so I think in terms of that kind of thing, I think that shows there is maybe some element of something at least very similar to catharsis. The fact that we can experience something that isn't relaxing, but then feel relaxed afterwards.
Yeah, it's a real, so it seems to be at odds, the idea that I would play something to relax and claim that I was relaxed by doing it. But if you actually look at my physiological responses, it doesn't look relaxed. It looks agitated. Yeah. It looks excited and not relaxed. Yeah, I guess maybe it comes down to, like, are you still less agitated than you were, before you started playing games, or, net result afterwards? Are you more recovered and have less stress after the fact? So, where do you think that this body of research should go next? If you had unlimited funds and a small army of graduate students, like, where would you take it?
So I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of the research at the moment is kind of survey-based. So there's been one lab study that was really interesting, and that was getting people in, sort of trying to simulate a work task and then testing them before and after, having played a game or watched a video, or and then they compared interactive and non-interactive media, and that was very, very interesting. So I think trying to replicate something similar to that, but then kind of go into it even further. So as I mentioned, about all the different genres, I think that would be really interesting to see whether that's actually causal, to see whether first-person shooters are actually better at inducing recovery, or whether it's more to do with the kinds of people who play first-person shooters, which is still a possibility. So I think trying to take it into the lab, but then obviously you've kind of got issues with trying to, you're trying to simulate a work task within an hour or something, and that's not going to be the same as having a full day at work. So I think sort of taking it to the lab, but then trying to take it back, back out into the real world. So I guess unlimited resources and unlimited grad students mean that, I could probably follow people around during the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Either catch people at the end of the workday, or have some sort of that ethnographic research where you have an app on their smartphone that surveys them throughout the day, or
a film crew, to do that. Get someone else to code all the data. I don't have to worry about that in my unlimited money scenario.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing. So the reason why I got interested in this area was just for the potential of having kind of a way of helping people who do need to recover but don't have a chance to recover. So I think in terms of my own interest in this, I think that the ideal study to be able to do would be to do an intervention study, to get people who maybe have childcare responsibilities or something that in the evening that may make it a bit more difficult for them to fit other activities in, and then just try to see whether playing games and playing different kinds of games, whether you're playing online games with other people, all these different kind of conditions, is just to see which would be most effective. And then because I think if we can stop people from getting to the point where they're experiencing prolonged work stress, then that would be fantastic. So
what would your advice be to somebody who is experiencing a lot of stress from work or school, and they're not necessarily a gamer? What would you suggest to them that they try?
So I suppose it depends on why they're not a gamer, I suppose. If they're not a gamer because they hate all games, then maybe
let's just say they never tried it. It never occurred to them.
So I think anything that's going to be immersive, anything that's going to ideally have a strong narrative, that seems to be something that's come out of the literature. Something that's fun, something that you can fit in, something you're not going to get stressed about. So if it's one of those games where you have to play for 20 hours before you can get through the first level, maybe not, unless you've got a lot of time on your hands, but something you can dip in and out of, but something that will kind of keep your interest, something that you'll find relaxing, something that will sort of stop you worrying about work or anything else. Also, anything that's kind of that feels low effort, I think is well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why potentially media helps is just because you're not having to stand up and run around. So something that won't require you to maybe not the Wii at the first stage. I don't know.
Right. It also seems like there could be some interesting research about the use of mobile games and sort of like fitting in mini recovery experiences throughout your day. You don't have to sit down for an hour at a computer or in front of a TV to play games. You can just take out your phone and play for 5 minutes. And what might that do to people's stress levels?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because I was trying to conduct a load of research on people playing games on the commute. Mm-hmm. It was something that I noticed when I was traveling within London. I'd look around and I'd see all these people on the tube or on the train playing games. And so it's something that was really interesting finding out. Turns out when you send out an online questionnaire, no one says they play games, which I found really, really interesting.
I wonder if they just don't think of those as games.
Well, the funny thing was we did, this isn't something that we've kind of worked out to be published or anything, but it was one of a student project that I was supervising. They were doing a diary study and they were asking people what they did on their commute overall and then asking them to report on it every day, kind of hoping that people would play games. And what they said that they did overall was so different from what they actually did. If you ask people what they do on their commute, most people say, "Oh, I work, I read." And if you ask them on a day-to-day basis, they're like, looked out the window.
Yeah.
I just read the paper. It's never that. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent again.
No, it's interesting though. I mean, that's sort of an age-old problem in psychology and related sciences where, you have social desirability. You ask people what they did, and they said, well, yeah, I got caught up on emails, or I wrote to my pen pal, or, I did the New York Times crossword puzzle or something where, yeah, you're right. What they did is they looked out the window or they played Candy Crush or, something along those lines.
But yeah, I think that it's something that I still really want to try to research is the idea. Because I think for a lot of people commuting is just dead time. And so it just seems like the perfect time. If playing games does help people recover, it seems like, people aren't going to miss that time. And if that does mean that they can just play Candy Crush or just play something very low effort. Mm-hmm. And if that can help, potentially.
Okay. Well, a lot of interesting stuff here. I appreciate your coming on and telling us all about it. I guess a couple of questions that I always ask just to kind of wrap up. First is, have you been playing anything yourself? Do you have much time to play games, or what are you into?
I am a terrible games researcher in that it always feels like work when I play games. And so because I need to psychologically detach from work, sometimes playing games is not the best thing to do.
That's true.
Although I have been watching my partner play Wolf Among Us, and I think I'm going to have to play that because that's just fantastic.
What game is that?
Oh, Wolf Among Us.
Oh, the Wolf Among Us. The Telltale games, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I played that a few months ago. It's really good. I enjoyed that a lot.
The thing that I found really strange about it was that I was really into it, even though I wasn't the one playing it. And you seem to have quite limited kind of actual interaction with it. But there is something about the narrative that is just so gripping that even just as a person just sitting there doing something completely different, I was like, oh my God, this is so good. Yeah. A lot of those, Telltale doesn't knock it out of the park every time, but when they do, like with Wolf Among Us and especially the first season of The Walking Dead and the one I played most recently, the Tales from the Borderlands is another really good one. They do really good. And those games sort of seem like non-games in a lot of ways. Like they're almost like interactive fiction in that they don't rely on twitch reflexes a lot, and a lot of times the decisions you're making aren't real apparent on how they're affecting the game, and you're not really necessarily customizing or building a character. But, they're still games, and if that's the sort of experience people are looking for, then they'll probably enjoy it just the same. Yeah, and there's just something about how they're done as well sometimes. It almost doesn't matter that you don't, that you're not kind of interacting much or that you don't know how that decision's made. And when you make the wrong decision, it is gutting. Yeah. Like even when my partner did, I was like, why did you do that? Yeah. Why?
Yeah, I still feel bad about ripping that one guy's arm off in Wolf Among Us. I don't know if you did that or not, but I felt bad the whole rest of the game for doing that.
It's weird how emotionally invested you can get.
Yeah, exactly. Felt like a real bummer. So, last question is, if people are interested in finding out about you and the research you're doing, where on the internet would they go to do that?
Oh, I have a staff page on the UCL website. So if you Google Emily Collins UCL, I come up quite high. I have a completely inactive Twitter, but if you'd like to follow me for that one time that I tweet something every year, I'm Dr. Emily Collins.
Okay. I'll include links to those in the notes for the show. So,
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much again for coming on to do this. It's interesting, and it seems like, and I know that recovery is a field of research that's been around for a while, but like you were saying, it seems like it's sort of at the ground level for application of video games to that concept. So I'm glad to hear about it and look forward to seeing what you and other people produce.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thanks. Take care. Well, congratulations on reaching the end of the podcast. I hope it was a nice, relaxing experience for you and recovered some mental resources by listening to it. Always remember you can go to psychologyofgames.com/podcast, and there you can find information on how to subscribe to the podcast to get all future and past episodes for free. You can also find out how to give me a rating on iTunes, which I always appreciate. And you can find out how to follow me on social media like Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of which, I'd kind of like to hear what you thought of this episode, and I'd like to hear any stories you have about using video games to recover from stress. Just go to psychologygames.com and you can find the blog post for this podcast episode, or you can go and find links there to my profiles on Twitter and Facebook and leave me a message there. And let me know how you have used games, either video or otherwise, to recover from stress and how that's played a positive role in your life. I'd like to hear about it. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next episode.